Hi, my name is Misha McDaniel, and I am with the Office of Innovation and Entrepreneurship. This is one of 3 videos that OIE has produced to assist applicants with navigating the requirements of our competitive grant programs. If you have not already, please review the videos on the SF424 and the SF424A, which are also referenced in this resource. Through its regional and headquarters offices, the EDA supports the development of effective entrepreneurial economic development ecosystems around the United States and the territories. OIE is based at EDA headquarters and manages several national grant competitions to drive state and regional economic development in line with our laser focus on innovation and entrepreneurship. OIE recognizes the complexity associated with navigating the systems and requirements of EDA's grant-making programs, and this video is intended to assist prospective applicants with successfully identifying and assembling the project costs necessary to include in a competitive EDA grant application. We will cover the 3 core components of the budget narrative, namely the narrative, budget chart, and staffing plan. And finally, we'll conclude with insights on how the budget narrative is evaluated in relation to other core components of the grant application. The best advice that we can provide prospective applicants is not to wait until the last minute to submit your application in grants.gov. As you can see in the diagram below, there are several requirements that must be completed prior to initiating and submitting an application in grants.gov. If your organization is a first-time applicant and/or you are new to the process, please take the time to ensure that the authorized organization representative has the credentials necessary to submit the proposal. To reiterate, the EDA strongly recommends submitting in advance of the application deadline, which is strictly enforced. Luckily, you can stay in the loop about upcoming grant opportunities by reviewing the EDA website, identifying relevant notice of funding opportunities, also known as NOFOs, and subscribe to updates on those NOFOs via grants.gov. The 2 key components of a project budget for an EDA grant proposal are the federal share and the non-federal share, commonly referred to as the match. The EDA generally expects the non-federal share of project costs, whether cash or in kind, to be paid out at the same general rate as the federal share. The budget narrative is a great place for applicants to illustrate how eligible funds will be used to achieve the goals of the proposal. The budget narrative also functions to allow reviewers to determine how federal funds will be allocated across various budget categories throughout the duration of the project. When considering what makes a compelling application for an EDA grant competition, the budget narrative is a great place to start. A clear budget narrative is an integral component of a competitive application because it allows for you to elaborate on the sources and uses of funds necessary to complete the objectives described in the project narrative. The budget narrative is reviewed for consistency in conjunction with other components of the application, namely the SF424, SF424A, project narrative, and any applicable commitment letters. As you assemble the resources for your proposal, please consider whether prospective sources of match funding satisfy the 3 following requirements on the text box to the left of being available at the time of application, unencumbered, and committed. A commitment letter is required for each source of match because reviewers use these letters to affirm that the proposed source meets the EDA's requirements. For your reference, we have provided 2 examples of match sources, cash on hand and anticipated revenue. As you can see, yes, cash on hand satisfies the EDA's requirements. And no, anticipated revenue, which is viewed as conditional and not committed, does not meet the EDA's requirements for an eligible match source. When it comes to satisfying the match requirement for an EDA competitive grant application, bigger is not necessarily better. The inclusion of match funds beyond the required threshold does not increase a project's competitiveness. Now that you have a big picture view of the role of the budget narrative in communicating the goals and capacities of your grant proposal, let's talk about the specific deliverables for this section of the application. For your convenience, OYE provides a budget template that is intended to help applicants comply with the technical requirements of this section. The use of the OIE provided template is optional, but the submission of a complete budget template is essential. As you can see, this chart can be used to organize the proposed grant expenses over the performance period. This helps reviewers evaluate the proposal's feasibility, most notably the extent to which the budget and narrative reasonably and realistically correspond to the costs and activities necessary for project success. As you review the template, note that each budget category response needs to include both an annual estimate of expenses and the share of expenses to be paid for with applicants' funds, referred to as the matching share, versus those to be covered by the grant, referred to as the federal share. Here's an example of the budget narrative guidance that's provided in an OIE Notice of Funding Opportunity. As you can see, every budget category requires a corresponding narrative response. Under the personnel category, there is an additional chart, the staffing plan, depicted here. The staffing plan consists of numerical inputs that allow reviewers to assess whether the proposed project has enough staff to carry out the work proposed, how much of each person's time will be allocated towards the project, and verify the consistency of those estimates with those described in other areas of the application. So what is the EDA looking for in the budget narrative? Great question. The next section summarizes what to look for to ensure that your submission meets EDA's requirements. Compliance with the requirements provided in the NOFO is a great place to start. Please make sure that the budget narrative, excluding commitment letters and other attachments, does not exceed the page limit guidance provided in the NOFO. And please make sure that indirect costs are properly accounted for in your numerical and narrative inputs. Check your budget narrative for consistency, meaning that it identifies and justifies how funds in each line item of the budget will be used to support the proposed project. Specifically, the totals in this section should correspond with the total project cost listed in both Form SF-424, Question 18, Line G, and the appropriate total fields from Form SF-424A. As you probably gathered, the EDA requires you to provide the annual salaries of key project personnel in several sections of the grant application. So, when you complete the staffing plan, it is important for you to confirm that the total federal share and total non-federal share correspond with the inputs listed on the SF-424A and the amounts provided in the budget chart. Finally, regarding match documentation, please verify that sources are eligible and documented in all relevant parts of the budget narrative. Please include itemized valuations of any in-kind matching contributions, and include a commitment letter for each match source, including one from the applying entity, if applicable. To review, when you complete the budget narrative section of your proposal, please utilize the 3 C's. Compliance. Ensure that your submissions comply with the guidance in the NOFO. Consistency. Check the amounts provided and make sure they correspond with the totals listed in the budget narrative and across the inputs across the proposal. And finally, capture the match. Verify that the funding sources you cite meet EDA's eligibility criteria previously described, and ensure that each source has a corresponding commitment letter. Thank you for taking the time to learn about the budget narrative requirement for OIE's competitive grant programs, and good luck with your application.